Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. And today, if you don't mind, I would very much like to continue on with our discussions, our exploration, and our journey through the recent Criterion Collection box set release that was made earlier this year of 2021. And such set is called World of Wong Kar Wai, and again, please pardon me for my poor pronunciation of the Cantonese language, World of Wong Kar Wai. And in such set, World of Wong Kar Wai, are a number of discs. The second of such Blu-ray discs sets forth the film, which was directed by Wong Kar Wai, or Wong Kar Wai, in 1990, and it is known in the Cantonese language as, again, please pardon me for my bad pronunciation, Afe Jing, or in English, Days of Being Wild. Extraordinary, hypnotic film from 1990, and it has a brilliant cast, included in which are Leslie Chung Kwok Wing and Andy Lau Takwa, Maggie Chung Manyuk, Karina Lau Kaling, Jackie Chung Yao, and Rebecca Pan. Once again, please pardon me for my very poor pronunciation, but this is the work from Wong Kar Wai, Afe Jing, or in English, Days of Being Wild. If we were to try to focus in on the plot or story structure of this remarkable work, I think we could focus our attention on the group of characters that we meet in this setting, early 1960s. Primarily, the setting is Hong Kong, primarily, and we do meet a number of characters within this setting, included in which, of course, is the character played by Leslie Chung, who is a type of playboy, who is someone who has a number of relationships, a number of intimate, romantic relationships, for example, the Maggie Chung character, and also the Karina Lau character. And in this depiction of the relationship dynamic, of course, we see the visual expression and style of Wong Kar Wai on display in a truly magnificent form in terms of the expressions of emotional intensity and erotic passions, and also the need for some kind of feeling and satisfaction, again, captured in the cinematic essence so brilliantly and so vividly. And also in this context, going back to plot or story structure discussion, I think we also see the way in which these relationships are evolving or not evolving. We see how the relationships display connections between human beings or don't display connections between human beings. And to be perhaps a little bit more specific, we see how, for example, there may be some differences in intensity levels as to how, for example, the Leslie Chung character, how much emotional investment he makes or doesn't make versus how much, say, the Maggie Chung character, how much emotional investment she makes or she yearns to make. And it's that divide, or it's that maybe miscommunication that leads to a type of heartbreak, a type of sense of yearning, and also an exploration or feelings of displacement and alienation and rejection, which also lead to further connections with other characters, for example, the Maggie Chung character and the Andy Lau character. And then also full circle, how the Andy Lau character makes a connection with the Leslie Cheung character. And then on the other side of the coin, of course, we have the Andy Lau character's relationship with Karina Lau's character, and how that is also a different relationship on the one hand, but also in a same or similar vein, another exploration as to the nature of this human relationship, the existence or non-existence of actual emotional and real human connections, and the reasons why such non-connection status might be had. Again, the level of emotional investment of one party versus the other, and how that ultimately unfurls, and the emotional consequences that result from these relationships, and how that leads to other connections made. For example, the Jackie Chung character, how he is related, or what his relationship is with Leslie Cheung's character or with Karina Lau's character. And this type of evolving dynamic of character dimensions and relationships on many sides of this group dynamic, I think, is one of the powerful, strong points of this film, and it creates the sense of balance and imbalance. It creates the sense of constant evolution, as well as of the moment, the exploration of the moment, as well as ever-changing feelings and attractions. And also, within this relationship dynamic, there's one other relationship that is very key. That is the relationship between the characters of Leslie Cheung and Rebecca Pan. And in this, we understand that this mother-son relationship is a very complex one, because it is one where we are talking about an adoption, so the adopted mother and son dynamic. And also in that context, we understand that Leslie Cheung's character is seeking or is yearning for some kind of truth as to who his birth mother is, and the need for such information, and the inability through certain details of circumstance and character. And I'm talking also about the mother character here. Through such circumstances, how such information is withheld from him, and the ultimate emotional results of that. And so what we have here, I think, is a number of various relationships that are displayed from various quarters and dimensions and corners of this network of characters. And we see the success or failure of the connections between these human characters. And when there is failure or miscommunication, there's a sense of yearning and longing and displacement and alienation, as well as the exploration of what might be called an emotional lethargy, if you will, or a type of wandering, or a sense of not necessarily knowing, or not necessarily knowing what one wants, might be one way of putting it, but perhaps more accurately it would be a sense of yearning or longing for something that is somewhere other than where the person is at that particular moment in time. And we see this, for example with the Leslie Cheung character, what it is he seems to be yearning for that is not in his current present moment, and what the emotional consequences are of that dynamic of yearning and longing and displacement. We also get this, of course, with the Maggie Cheung character, and what she wants versus what she has or doesn't have in that particular moment. The same is true for the Karina Lau character, the same is true for the Jackie Cheung character, the same is true for the Andy Lau character. And so in this we see displacement, we see yearning, longing, and a passion and emotion, and also the emotional consequences, and how that leads to further thematic concerns as to the possibility, if any, of a type of connection between human beings. And if there is no connection, then what are the emotional consequences of such seemingly devastating circumstances? So I would suggest that this is perhaps the essence of the plot of the film. And there is a journey sense, there is a sense of a search or quest as well. The film does explore those, and how the characters are, as I say, yearning for things, and how they try in their own ways, depending on the character arc, how they try to seek the information or that thing or those people or that person that they are longing for, and what the eventual outcomes are of such journeys. And so this is very much a journey film and an emotionally complex and rich film, and it is highly passionate and very erotic in terms of its immediate displays of human intimacy of the moment. But then we step back and realize that the moment is oftentimes contrasting with, or perhaps in conflict with, or in contradiction vis-a-vis the sort of universal moment. So the intimate, personal moment of the now, the ephemeral moment, is oftentimes contrasted against the larger concern. And so that temporal space connection and dynamic, I think, what leads to a further complex development of the film. This is a film that is very hot and very cold. It is a film about the moment and the passing of the moment. It is also a film about the long stretch of time. It is a film about the lack of human connection, but it is also a film about the strength of and warmth of human connection vis-a-vis memory and dream. And so in this way, it is observing and capturing and encapsulating many tones and senses at once. And yes, it is hot in terms of its passion and eroticism, and it is very cold in terms of its implications of lack of human connections and the emotional consequences of such devastating circumstances. And so it is many things at once, which makes it, I think, a supremely complex and rich and rewarding experience within the context of the filmography of Wong Kar Wai, and also as a cinematic viewing experience. This is one of my absolute favorite films by Wong Kar Wai. And whenever I was asked, what is your favorite Wong Kar Wai film? It would be very difficult because there's so many, actually. There are so many that I could say, this is my favorite Wong Kar Wai film, this is my favorite Wong Kar Wai film, that one is my favorite Wong Kar Wai film. Sometimes I would say my favorite Wong Kar Wai film is Days of Being Wild. I absolutely adore this film. I think it is so passionate and so devastating. It is so rich and also so mysterious. It is very ethereal and also very grounded, and also there is a sense of the feelings and the passions that strike us all, as well as the mysteries and the unknown factor that we will never know about the other, and perhaps we will never know about ourselves. And so I love this combination of contradictions and paradoxes that also form the backdrop, if you will, of the truly dazzling and arresting visual style and musical choice and overall environment and atmosphere and feel of this film. One of my favorites. This is the film Days of Being Wild. And I think also we can look at this film in the context of the filmography or the cinematic style of Wong Kar Wai. And I think we can start to see, much like, say, our discussion of the earlier work, As Tears Go By, we can begin to see also various connections or similarities, as well as certain things that we might see in subsequent or upcoming films. So, for example, in my earlier discussion about the character development and examination themes, I tried to suggest that there is this idea of the intimate nature of character portraits, and how the intimate character portraits can be suggestive of many things at once: the passionate as well as the cold, the intimate as well as the devastating, etc., etc. And so I think this type of myriad nature, complex myriad nature of this film, I think is indicative of the film overall, because it is a film of various stages and forms and levels. Another such level, I would suggest, is the concept of concepts of existence and also concepts of time, and how these two concepts are related. Now, in this film, interestingly enough and extraordinarily enough, the concept of time is examined in terms of, say, broad thematic characterizations and concerns, in the way that We have a film that is set in the past, in the 1960s, so there's this feeling of a story that is beyond our current state as we are watching, we the viewers are watching it, so it is a state beyond our particular reach in terms of a temporal quality. And yet it is a film that is seemingly about characters who are undergoing some kind of emotional turmoil or relationship issues that I think are also very fundamentally universal and human, thus making their stories very relatable in many respects, at least potentially speaking. So there is that inherent, I think, lovely contradiction of a sort of timeless quality as well as the beautifully poetic timed quality, if you will. So it's captured in the moment, but it's also universal. And so this idea in temporal terms, or in the context of a discussion of time and temporal space, is this thesis, if you will, that what is universal, what is intimate and of the moment and ephemeral and fleeting, it is minute and minuscule, and it is there and it disappears immediately. That singular moment of intimate expression is also at the same time linked to a grand sense of the concept of time and space. And so that type of temporal discussion, I think, is very much parallel with the way that the character interactions and the character space and the emotional spaces of the characters are being developed and examined and evolved as the film progresses. So the concept of temporal space as a thematic concern. It's also fascinating too because time is also a concept that is discussed directly by the characters themselves. There's a notion, for example, of the power of the minute, 1 minute. It is fleeting, and yet it is, on the one hand, it is a very short amount of time, this 1 minute space, and yet at the same time it seems to capture or fill in a space that can feel infinite. So it is at the same time both infinite and also fleeting, and that contradiction is so wonderful and is expressed in wonderful lines of dialogue, say between Leslie Cheung and Maggie Cheung, and also echoed by the Andy Lau character in terms of the power of 1 minute, and also by extension, it's not just the idea of the minute or space of time that is paradoxically both fleeting and also universal. It is also universally. It also has the aspect of the universal in that the scope of the plot also involves the concept of not just the 1 minute or the 1 minute friend or the 1 minute pengyo, but it's also the idea of time and memory, the idea of this space and time that existed but no longer exists, but what one remembers of that moment, even much after that moment has passed, that can still live on, or can it? And in that possibility of remembrance and memory of a particular temporal moment of the past, therein I think we see the link between the ephemeral and immediately disappearing nature of time itself in a singular moment, but also the potential of the infinite nature of time and memory, and how it can still linger on in our memories and in our hearts, in the characters, say, of Andy Lau and Leslie Cheung and Maggie Cheung, for example, long after the moment has passed. And so I find this type of engagement, both on a plot and character level and also on a thematic level, to be very, very emotionally moving. And it is something that makes time both subjective and objective. It means that time has this amorphous ability to be boundless as well as to be somewhat inscrutable. And that, I think, that kind of frustration inherent in the concept or the perception of time is a wonderful parallel with the idea of an emotional frustration that each of the characters feel in terms of their emotional longing or their loss or their lack of what it is they understand or think or feel that they want at that particular moment. They want something that they don't have, and they want something that is oftentimes outside of their space of the moment, and that can be an emotional space, but that can also be a geographical and or temporal space. And if we think of it in that way, then we can also understand that their longings therefore only find expression of a satisfactory nature, potentially anyway, in not just how they feel about what they are longing for, but how they remember what they are longing for. And it's that expression of memory and time that forms the basis of a lot of the poetry of the dialogue of how, say, Maggie Cheung is expressing what it is she is feeling, or how Leslie Cheung is talking about the memory or the aspect of what he recalls or what he is trying to think at a particular moment that is very significant in his life, at a significant event of the film, and so on and so forth. And so that discussion, that continual discussion between time, memory, and characters and emotion, I think, is on full display in this film in an extraordinary and complex way that still maintains a sense of the type of emotional, say, it still maintains a sense of the intuitively, innately accessible. Let me put it that way. In other words, it can, I think, operate on these levels, but still always maintain a sense of the accessible or the understandable. There is a way in which we can sense or feel this notion of time and space and memory being wonderfully hallucinatory and hypnotic and perhaps even manipulated in this poetic way. So I find this film on that level to be very engaging indeed. Also, in that same vein, we have, much like in the film As Tears Go By, and also much like in films that we will see later in the box set here, World of Wong Kar Wai, we see the importance. I mentioned the way in which characters relate to time. There's also the way in which characters relate to space, the geographical space, and also the environment, the space, and what are the emotional implications of such interactions between oneself and the space. And this space can be, as I say, geographic in terms of the settings. We have Hong Kong as the setting, the early 1960s Hong Kong, and also the Philippines. And we have jumps in terms of where the film is set, and then we have certain the way in which the plot develops and jumps from one place to another in a very, I think, poetically abrupt and appropriately abrupt way. But we see in this jump, I think we see in this context, I think, a number of very interesting things at play, which are very much part, I would suggest, of the Wong Kar Wai cinematic experience. So I was mentioning before about how each of the characters, I would suggest, is being explored in this film by virtue of the fact that he or she is longing for something that is outside of themselves, that is something that they want, that is not what they have at the moment. And in that way, they have emotional turmoil and also a type of spiritual or emotional consequences of that, and what it is they do, what choices they make as a result of such longing. And this is very important too, because the way in which the film shifts from its environment, from one environment to another, geographic locales are changed in a very important way in terms of the progression of the plot. But this is also, I think, an outward metaphorical expression of this idea of longing and the search. After all, from the viewpoint of the Leslie Cheung character, we understand that what he is longing for perhaps is something not in Hong Kong, but perhaps in the Philippines. And so what does he do? He is longing for something that is outside of where he is at the moment. He is in Hong Kong, but what he is longing for, we understand, is in the Philippines. So that is physically and geographically speaking outside where he is at the given moment. But it is through his actions as a result of such longing that we have the film jump. And I find this to be a metaphorically powerful move, because this is an indication of how this film is also an emotional journey and search quest film. This is a film about quests, about how the characters are on the journey towards the destination of that which they are longing for. And it is outside of themselves, but it's also an attempt of the characters to try to break free from their surroundings and to achieve whatever their goal is. And I find this particular search aspect expressed so beautifully in the way that geography is treated. And I should say also that the environment and is also found expression in the way, not just in terms of geographic locations, but also in upbringing because we understand, again, using the Leslie Cheung character as essentially as our character focal point, we understand that because of certain details surrounding his upbringing and how his adopted mother told him information but also withdrew or did not or withheld information from him, we understand that that situation of his upbringing, which also has a suggestion of a type of status of wealth or class, despite such traits, there is this lack in his particular upbringing, at least from his perspective. And so that has emotional results as well. And it results, I think it manifests itself quite strikingly in the relationship between the Rebecca Pang character and the Leslie Cheung character. It is a very complex one. It is potentially quite a dark one. It is also a very antagonistic one. It is also a very tense one. And so these are the emotional consequences of not just geography and place, but also upbringing, which is also part of one's environment, the environment of one's upbringing. And so this is all to say that, again, in the context of Wong Kar Wai's films, or Wong Kar Wai, we have the importance and the thematic importance of environment, geography, and space. And we see that this is linked quite directly to the intimate levels of the characters in this film, Days of Being Wild, in terms of feeling longing, loss, abandonment, rejection, alienation. And when we consider these themes of alienation and abandonment and displacement and rejection as connected, I think, in a metaphorical way with place and environment and locale and geography, then again we can understand that I think inherent in this is some kind of sense of identity on a cultural or national level, especially once again when we think of the relationship, say, between Hong Kong and the rest of the world. For example, the relationship between Hong Kong and mainland China. And so this idea of characters relating to themselves and each other, and also characters relating to space, time, and memory as captured by this film, these ways are truly breathtaking, extraordinary, poetic, powerful, surprising, alluring, and utterly, utterly captivating. These are the reasons why I consider this to be one of my absolute favorites in the filmography of Wong Kar Wai. It is, even now, it could be one of my absolute favorites. And depending on the time of day, if you ask me the question, what is your favorite Wong Kar Wai film, I could say this film. I could say others as well, because there are so many to choose from, as we know, but I could also say this film. I really love this film, Days of Being Wild, and it remains a powerful reminder, a beautiful, passionate, exotic, erotic, a truly poetic and visually masterful reminder of just how great the cinema of Wong Kar Wai is. This is the film Days of Being Wild. So the Criterion Collection release is this new box set, of course, and this is, of course, purported to be a 4K restoration of the film, and so I will talk about the restoration version as included in this box set momentarily. But before I get to those comments, let me also just mention that this is the second disc in this box set, and such second disc, in addition to the film itself, has a number of supplements. So the first such supplement is what is deemed to be the alternate version, or an alternate version of this film. And I must say that I saw this alternate version and I was, simply put, dazzled. I was so dazzled by this film. I was already dazzled by the standard version, if you will, of the film Days of Being Wild. But this alternate version is magnificent and extraordinary for a number of reasons. So first of all, it is an alternate version. And I think that is going to become very significant when we talk about the comments on the restoration. As I say, I'll get to that momentarily. But okay, first we have an alternate version. It is an alternate version, and I'll try to be as general as possible here. But it's an alternate version because of certain changes that can be found. In particular, I should take a step back. For the most part, I think the story and the story arcs and the order of scenes is more or less intact, or it is similar to what we find in the so-called standard version. There are some differences, and perhaps one of the most striking and noticeable differences is the way that the alternate version starts. The opening sequence of the alternate version is very different than the way that the standard version opens. And if you know the film, Days of Being Wild, you know it starts a certain way and it also ends in a certain way. And one of the most extraordinary aspects of the film is how it ends. And again, I don't want to say too much about it because I don't want to spoil it for people who haven't seen it. But let me just say that Days of Being Wild ends in one of the most extraordinary ways I have ever seen in a film. It is truly extraordinary. I love how the essay in the Criterion box set here refers to it or compares the ending or the power of the ending or the extraordinary nature of the ending of Days of Being Wild to a film like, say, Michelangelo Antonioni's L'Eclisse. And I think that comparison is so on point because it is indeed that extraordinary. In that way, what we have in the alternate version of the film that's included on the second disc is the way that the film starts in the alternate version is using some of the stuff that was hinted at or otherwise shown at the very end of the film. So we have this way in which the alternate version is using the ending in an attempt to try, in essence, to create a bookmark structure in a way. Also, the alternate version opening montage hints at what could have been in terms of little shots or scenes or little moments or images or details or rumors that could have hinted at what we understand might have occurred had there been a direct sequel made of this film, Days of Being Wild. And this is also discussed a little bit in some of the other supplemental features. But in those ways, this alternate version, I think, is extraordinary. And I should say, too, that there is a particular song that is used over the end credits of the film, Days of Being Wild. And in this particular Criterion version, the standard version, the restoration standard version, when you get the end credits and the song sung in the Cantonese language, unfortunately there are no subtitles as the song lyrics are being sung, but that same song is being used over the opening sequence of the alternate version, and in that use, in fact, there are subtitles being provided for the lyrics as they're sung in this song as it's being used in the alternate version. I find that detail to be so great. That is such a great detail, and so you realize you can listen in, and I don't understand the language, so I can't make out what is being sung, but if I read the subtitles, I realize, my goodness, there is such a strong dynamic link between the song, the lyric, and the image, and it becomes like this pop music video, but it's also so linked to each of the character details, and it's also talking about the thematic concerns that I was trying to allude to before. Past and present collide in this extraordinary way. And so I just want to suggest to you that the inclusion of this alternate version is so exciting. It is very exciting, and it made me feel a different way when it came to this film, and so I was so glad. I feel so fortunate that it's included here, so to give us the opportunity to examine it and to see what it might hint at as far as other directions or other avenues, or what it might otherwise embellish as to our current understanding of the version Days of Being Wild. It's extraordinary. Well done for being able to include it here as part of the supplements for the second disc. But that's not all, because we also get a 2005 discussion or lecture given by Christopher Doyle, 10 minutes at National Film Theatre in London. And this is very important because Christopher Doyle is the cinematographer of this film, and his contribution is magnificent. And we have to state that his contribution with Wong Kar Wai or Wong Kar Wai will be one of the great collaborations, and it will mark a lot of the visual richness and arresting quality of the camera work that will I mean, we've seen it before, but there's just something magical about this relationship, and that we will see at play very strongly. And we see it here as well. And it is also exemplified by what Christopher Doyle is saying in this lecture, which is a lecture but also presented almost like a type of select scene analysis or commentary, because he also talks about certain scenes as they are playing, and he talks about the camera movements as they're going on, little details about who was appearing in the scenes at the time, little details about the background and the like. Also, there is comment here by Christopher Doyle about what he describes as being the attempt by him and Wong Kar Wai to try to achieve in visual terms the green color palette of a monochromatic quality, and how this is a type of cinematic catharsis. That's his word. And so he does place emphasis at this point. Again, this is a 2005 lecture in London. He does emphasize the idea of the color palette of this film, the green monochromatic nature. That's how he describes it. And this is going to be very important when we talk about the restoration a little bit later in this video. This also echoes some comments that he made in a program, a moving images program, that is actually found in the supplements on the disc for the film Chungking Express. So but just keep this in mind. He does mention this idea of the importance of green and capturing the green elements, and to try to achieve this monochromatic look. So that is also very interesting. So that's the Christopher Doyle lecture, if you will, or talk at 2005, approximately 10 minutes. And then we have an audio interview or excerpt interview with Maggie Chung Manyuk, and this is described as being from 1994. It's approximately 4 minutes. So, but we have her comments directly. This is great. This is so great because Maggie Chung talks, for example, about, she describes Days of Being Wild. She talks about, of course, working with Wong Kar Wai on As Tears Go By, and how it, in her words, changed her career. And then she describes Days of Being Wild as being her favorite film in the films that she worked in. I love that comment so much, and that emphasizes just how great her performance. She is electrifying in this film, and the type of emotional depth and sorrow that her character presents in many of her scenes is extraordinary. How it's expressed by the beautiful acting craft of Maggie Chung. It cannot be emphasized enough. It's great. And so to get her comments about this is wonderful. Also, she does give comments about the possibilities, what had been planned as far as a possible sequel that never was, but we understand there kind of is a sequel, but there was actually plans for something else. And she was actually talking about this in the context of what I was referring to as the way that the film ends, and the type of scene that it is, and who we see in this particular scene, and what this character represents, if anything. And so Maggie Chung talks a little bit about some of the background details or circumstances of what could have been but ended up not being. But still, those comments, I think, are extraordinary, and they give yet more dimension and life to this idea, the myth of Days of Being Wild, the film itself, and also what follows beyond the credits in the world of the film. So this is extraordinary stuff. So that's approximately 4 minutes, and that's it as far as the the supplements go, I should mention also the essay. I will talk about the essay in more detail in a separate video, but I should just mention that the essay does mention, for example, links to or connections with or significant aspects of the film. For example, I mentioned the working relationship, with Christopher Doyle. There's also a very powerful and important working relationship with William Chang Suk-ping. And this is going to be very important also when we see subsequent films. It is also very important here in terms of the look, feel, and design of the piece, the mood and the historic feel of it, and the sense of the, in a positive way, the antiqueness, if you will, but also a sense of being modern at the same time. And this is captured very well in the look. And so William Chang Suk-ping is very consequential in that discussion. And so I'm glad that the essay points that out. Also, there are great connections, I think, with literature. Manuel Puig and Heartbreak Tango is mentioned, and also we could say that there are other literary connections or allusions or references, both direct or indirect, that could be made with other works of literature, both past, present, and subsequent. Kudos to the essay for bringing up those and other points, and I will talk in more detail or about my reaction to the essay in a separate video. But in those ways, my friends, I think we're getting a very interesting discussion. Of course, I would have loved to have seen more supplements. It would have been great if there was, say, a commentary track. It would have been great if there were more discussions about Days of Being Wild from an academic standpoint, interviews, experts, and the like. We may see other references in other discs supplements found in the box set. We might see other discs that have supplements that might make reference to Days of Being Wild. So let us keep that in mind as we explore the set. But for now, even though it might be seen to be lacking in some departments, I must emphasize once again that one of the great strengths is the inclusion of the alternate version. So we're getting two versions of a really brilliant film, two great versions of a really brilliant film, Days of Being Wild. Speaking of which, my friends, now I must turn my attention to the 4K digital restoration as presented here by the Criterion Collection. And so this is one of the issues of this set in general, in that we have restorations that are, depending on the film, you have certain degrees of changes or alterations or certain quote-unquote fixes, depending on your point of view, that have been applied to each of these presentations. And again, depending on what film you're talking about in the set, in my opinion, you will get varying degrees of intensity in terms of these changes. Some of them are subtle and perhaps even almost imperceptible. Others are quite drastic and quite noticeable. And so that is the situation with that. I will try to speak a little bit more in detail in separate videos about this issue writ large as it affects my overall view of this set. But I will emphasize once again that I am of the opinion that while, I have nothing inherently against changes being made. I understand there is this idea about if something is released, then that release version in that form should be respected, even by the filmmaker. And so if even the filmmaker makes some changes after the fact, then that is a very significant, big deal indeed. And I totally get that. I completely get that. So in that context, I never listen, or I never take any news about subsequent changes made by a filmmaker or about this film or that. I never look at that news and think that that news in itself is inherently negative. I don't think of it that way. But what I do think of is the ultimate end result. Namely, how does that end result, that new version, how do I feel about it? And also in that discussion, I should say that even though I have that approach about new versions, or I'm sorry, let me just say one more thing. I'm so sorry. When I look at a new version, then the final question I ask myself is, do I like it or do I not like it? And so sometimes you have a changed version that I might like. Sometimes there's a changed version that I won't like. And so it really depends on what the changes are and what my feelings about the films are, and what my eventual takeaway of it is. And in that context and in that conversation, I must say that one of the important things that I really respect, if possible, would be to have previous or prior non-restoration versions included whenever possible. And so to have many versions of the same film included to give us, the viewer, the opportunity to make up our own minds and to do a kind of comparative analysis on our own. We can watch the various versions. Again, I'm sure the presentation quality might differ depending on the existing materials, etc. So assuming certain changes or differences on that level, still we can, to a certain degree anyway, have a basis on which we can compare and contrast, and thus ultimately make up our own minds and make our own decisions as to what version we prefer. And so in that way, I really respect it when it is possible for, say, a label to include as many versions as possible. Now, I understand the possibility of the logistics, intellectual property rights, licensing limitations. Maybe it is not possible at all because the rights aren't owned or licensed to the particular label. I completely understand that. So circumstances vary and are many and varied, but be that as it may, if it could happen, then I welcome that opportunity. So in this context, my friends, what we have here with Days of Being Wild is a film in its restoration version that is, in my view, very noticeably different than, say, some of the other versions that I have seen of this film. And I have a number of versions on disc, non-Criterion release on disc, that I watched also many times after seeing the restoration. Well, I watched those many times before, and then I watched the restoration version a number of times, and then I watched those previous versions a number of times, and then I returned to the restoration version and tried to do as much of a comparison as possible in my own head. So I understand, and I personally get why people might say that there's a lot of change made to this, because I notice it. It's there. To be very general about it, I think there is a green color that is very much applied to a lot of the scenes in this film. It is not, I would say, a blanket application of it, because there are some select moments where the green haze is, interestingly enough, not there, not present. And in some scenes, it could be said that some of the earlier non-restoration versions of Days of Being Wild, some scenes, not all, but some scenes in the earlier versions feel a little bit greener to my eye than, say, the restoration version, that particular scene. So for the most part, there's a lot of green. Sometimes the green is subdued and the earlier version seems more green. Other times the green is subdued almost completely in favor of a bright light effect or feel. And that is an interesting type of contrast, because it suggests the possibility that maybe the green application has some kind of psychological or impact on the way that we perceive certain story elements and also time and space, which is what I was suggesting earlier, one of the key components in my view of this film. So in that way, while I noticed it, and while I found it very noticeable, based on, say, what I was used to in terms of my experience with the earlier versions, while I noticed it, I will say this: it felt like there was, say, a psychological effect that it was causing in me. And I'll try to explain what that was. So first of all, the earlier versions that I was used to had a type of, there were green elements to it. Let's say the background, there were certain maybe color decors that were green, maybe certain colors of the curtains or the backdrop of the leaves or something, or some chair or some color of the costume, etc. There was oftentimes a green element that was embedded in the mise-en-scène itself. And so I think that links very naturally to an application of a type of green haze in visual terms. So in that way, while I noticed the change in this restoration, I didn't find it inherently or immediately jarring, because it did feel somewhat in keeping with that type of tone that I found inherent in, say, the earlier versions of the film itself, through the details of decor, mise-en-scène, etc. So that's one thing. In that spirit, then what I was trying to determine in my own mind was what was the psychological impact that it was having on me. And I think, for me anyway, what it did was, the green haze of the film in general had this very interesting effect of making me feel like I was watching something that was aged. It felt more aged to me. And I mean that in a way that it was linking it to the 1960s in my own mind. It was like watching a photograph. You know, there's this thing about how you have photographs from many years ago, and those photographs have this aged quality, and it has a certain tint to the image. And I found that the green application in my eyes, or in my perception of it, seemed in some way to lend itself to this aged quality. And I think that is in keeping very much so with the comments made by Christopher Doyle, for example, in how he was suggesting that he and Wong Kar Wai were trying to achieve a type of monochromatic look, a type of look that is akin to, say, a black and white feel, or something that is maybe relying on a certain degree of, say, a color scheme in favor of another type of color scheme. In other words, the idea of something that might seem to have a color scheme to suggest age or some kind of fixed point in time. And when I thought about that, and when I looked at the film again and again, the restoration version, I really felt that. I felt that it felt like it belonged more in the 1960s in a manner of speaking. Now, that's not to say that the earlier versions that I saw were bereft of that. On the contrary, they still felt part of that story, that 1960s story. But the way that they are lit, in terms of, say, the use of what might be called a more direct bright light in those earlier versions, made those versions feel, in an interesting way, somewhat more modern in a visual manner of speaking. Whereas this green haze, in my view, for me, made the look more period. And I think that difference, is very interesting, because if it makes it feel more period, then what that does to me psychologically as a viewer, it has many potentials, but I think one of such potential would be it really emphasizes the fact that I'm watching something that is both timeless and of a certain time period. And I think that even further enhances or strengthens or augments this viewpoint that I was trying to hypothesize earlier, which is the idea that this is a paradoxical film. This is a film that is both at the same time about universality and timelessness, but also about a particular point in time. And I think the green haze and the identification I have with that, color-wise, with a sense of age, I think really, in an interesting way, almost is consistent with that viewpoint. Also, on a personal level, I must say that the idea of the use of green has this sense, in a cinematic visual term, of a suggestion of haze and hallucination and almost dream and imagination. And I have this because, and I'll be specific here, I am a big fan of the Alfred Hitchcock film from the 1950s called Vertigo. And if you know the film Vertigo, I think you will recognize that there is a really interesting application of the color green in some really key scenes that could be said also to have a sort of hallucinatory or ethereal quality about them that could also be said to be quite timeless, or somehow suggestive or indicative of a sense of fantasy incorporated in a sense of timelessness. In other words, the perception of temporal space, again, as suggested by the use of green in the film Vertigo. And I love the film Vertigo, and so in that way, I maybe have this sort of association in my mind with the color green, and in that way, I think that association also is existent when I consider the restoration version and the use of this color palette on display here. This idea, much like how I watched the film Vertigo, here it has this hallucinatory, ethereal quality about it, which also enhances the types of themes that I was talking about earlier. Finally, I should say that some of the earlier versions, not all, but some of the earlier versions, the use of the light, the white light, the bright lights, almost has a sense of the lights shining on the scenes very intensely in certain parts, like hot spots. Whereas the restoration version and the application of this color palette, in an interesting way, almost balances out any hotspots that might occur in a particular scene. In other words, it seems to equalize the light in a way that, again, further balances the existence of, say, the application of the light and how it interacts with the scene and the people. And I think that way also has this effect of making it less modern feeling and more vintage or period feeling in an interesting way. Again, I'm very poor in my ability to express it, but this is these are the examples of why I think I recognize the differences between, say, the earlier versions and this new restoration version. I recognize the differences, and I do find the differences to be quite noticeable, very, very noticeable indeed. But I can go along with the fact that they are arguably thematically consistent with my reading of the film, or one of my readings of the film. And in fact, they further augment or enhance my readings of the film in those ways that I was suggesting. Now, this is a very complex film, and so this is a film where it can be open to many different types of readings and perspectives and interpretations. And so in your interpretation or perspective, if you feel that this green application is distracting or not consistent, then I think that's very valid. Again, it depends on your interpretation or perspective. But what I can say for me is I can see that this application of the restoration, or within the restoration, can be said to be not just consistent, but also enhancing a type of interpretation or perspective that I have of this film, Days of Being Wild. And so I take to this restoration version quite well. I should also say, too, that maybe my positive feelings are also due to the fact that I can look at this film and I understand that there is an alternate version included in this particular disc. And as I was indicating earlier, I think the inclusion of an alternate version goes a long way. Now, I know it's not the exact version. It is alternate. There are differences, as I was indicating earlier, with the opening montage, etc. But the point is, in terms of a presentation picture quality, you can see a certain difference between the two versions. And so for those of you who might want a type of comparative analysis on your side, I think you can rely on this particular disc in this set, because you will have this quote-unquote standard restoration version, and then you will have the alternate version. And then you can compare and contrast and conduct your own comparative analysis, and hopefully you can reach your own conclusions as to what version you prefer. Again, once again, it depends on your interpretation, your mood, feel, and take on the film. But whatever it is, I think there is a lot of potential and possibility in this discussion of the restoration, at least when we're talking about this film, Days of Being Wild. Okay, my friends, so that's it for now as far as this film is concerned and the context of this box set. But I will keep on discussing the works as we go through this set, and so I look forward to seeing you at the next video. Until then, my friends, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great, great movies. So until we meet again, take very good care of yourselves, and cheers.